My sister was alive. She was standing at the edge of a rock overhang 11 miles from where she had vanished, and she was alive. 12 years old by then, lean and dark-eyed and watching me the way a deer watches a man who has not yet decided to be dangerous. There were scratches on her forearms that had healed clean. Her hair had grown past her shoulders. She was wearing a piece of hide over a shirt that was not the shirt she had been wearing the last time I saw her. Not the yellow cotton shirt my mother had put on her the morning of August 14th, 1979. She looked at me and she said my name. That was the first thing. She said Ray, and I sat down in the snow because my legs stopped working. I have been carrying the rest of that story for 42 years. I am 71 years old. I have spent the better part of my life working the bush country east of Quesnel, first alongside my father on his trapline, then as a licensed guide for 29 years, running hunters and surveyors through the Caribou Plateau and the drainages north of the Cottonwood River. I know that country the way a man knows his own house in the dark. I know where the ground softens in the third week of April. I know where the coyotes den above the clay cut banks. I know the difference between a track made in a fresh snow and a track that has been through one freeze-thaw cycle and softened at the edges. I am not a man who misreads country. I want to be clear about that because what I'm about to tell you is the kind of account that a man in my position has no business telling. And I have known that for 42 years, and I have kept my mouth shut for 42 years. And the reason I am done keeping my mouth shut is that my father is gone, and my father's promise died with him, and my mother died in 2004, knowing the full truth. And I will not take this to the ground the way every other man who knew it took it. So I will start at the beginning. I need to go back to August 1979 to explain what I was doing, standing in that drainage in March 1982, looking at my sister. My father, Frank Reynolds, was a trapper. He ran lines in the upper Cottonwood country for 30 years, a territory that covered roughly 60 miles of drainage from the river bottom up into the second growth timber above the 2,000-foot mark. Hard country, rocky creek beds and alder thickets and the kind of dense spruce forest that closes behind you fast enough to make a grown man anxious. He had worked that ground since he was a young man, and he knew every game trail and overwintering draw in it. I went with him from the time I was old enough to be useful, which my father defined as about 7 years old, carrying trap sets and learning to read the country before I was reading much else. My sister Della was 9 in the summer of 1979, 4 years younger than me. She was small for her age, and she had my mother's eyes and a temper that belonged to nobody else in the family. She would not back down from anything. Our mother used to say she came out arguing and had not stopped since, and that was true enough. She was not a child who frightened easily. We were camped at a flat on the south side of the upper Cottonwood in the second week of August, a spot my father used every summer as a base when he was running his late summer line checks. There was a fire ring made of flat stones that had been there since before I was born. There was a canvas tarp we stretched between 2 spruce trees when it rained. There was a gravel bar in the creek where Della and I used to turn over rocks looking for crayfish while my father worked his sets up the drainage. August 14th was a clear morning. Cool for that time of year, which I remember because my mother had put a light jacket on Della over that yellow shirt, and Della had pulled the jacket off by mid-morning and left it on a rock by the fire ring. My father was up the creek half a mile working a beaver set. My mother had gone back to the truck to get the food box she had forgotten. I was supposed to be watching Della. I was not watching Della. I had found a grouse feeding at the edge of the timber, and I was following it the way a 13-year-old boy will follow a grouse, moving quiet, watching it pick through the grass at the tree line. I was maybe 100 yards from camp. When I came back, My mother was there with the food box, and Della was not. We waited 20 minutes thinking she had gone to find my father. She had not. My father and I searched that drainage on foot until dark. We covered both sides of the creek for 3 miles in each direction. We found her jacket still on the rock. We found a single footprint in the mud near the water, a small one, the toe pointing upstream. We found nothing after that. The RCMP search ran for 17 days. They brought in dogs from Prince George. They flew the drainage by helicopter twice. They had 31 people in that country at the height of it. Volunteers from Quesnel and Barkerville, and 3 ranches east of town. They found the footprint, and they found a piece of her hair caught on a willow branch 30 feet upstream from where she had been standing. And they found nothing else. On the 31st of August, 1979, the search was concluded without result. The file stayed open in the technical sense, the way those files do, but the active search was done. My mother did not accept it. I do not use that as a dramatic description. I mean it practically. She would not use the word dead. She would not sit with the families who brought casseroles and said they were sorry for her loss. She would look at those people and say, "She is not lost," and the conversation would end. My father said nothing at those times. He would stand at the edge of the room and hold his coffee cup and say nothing. What he did say about 3 weeks after the search ended was that he was going back out to run his fall line. That was not unusual. The fall line was income, and the line did not wait for grief. What was unusual was the food he packed. He took in roughly 3 times what he needed for a solo week on the trap line: canned goods, dried meat, oatmeal. He packed it in a wooden box that he did not bring back with him. I was 13 and I asked him about it. He looked at me for a moment and said he was leaving some stores at the far cabin in case the weather turned hard. There was no far cabin. I did not know that then. I learned it 2 years later when he took me back on the line and I saw the old cache spots, square depressions in the soft duff where a box had sat through a winter, the rings of compressed moss and the rusted lid of a canned goods can sitting at the edge of one of them. By then, I was old enough to do the math and young enough to still be frightened by it. I asked him what the caches were. He said he had been leaving food out, in case. I asked in case of what. He said he was not sure yet and he would tell me when he was. Hatch was my dog by then, a blue tick hound I had gotten the spring after Della vanished. My father had suggested it, which was unusual because he was not a man who kept dogs for company, only dogs for work, and Hatch was solidly a work dog, long-eared and serious and absolutely reliable on a track. I had run him on the trapline from the time he was 10 months old, and he was as good in heavy timber as any dog I ever worked with. He did not spook easily. He did not bark at nothing. He would not approach certain tree lines. The first time I noticed it, I thought he had winded a bear. He stopped at the edge of a spruce stand about a mile above the creek flat and would not move forward. His nose was up and his tail was level, and he was not afraid exactly, but he was not going in. I pushed him and he circled wide, 40 yards out, moving carefully until we were past the edge of the trees, and then he was fine. I put it down to bear and forgot it. It happened 5 more times across 2 falls, always in the same general area within 2 or 3 miles of where Della had gone. Always the same response. Nose up, tail level, a wide, careful circle around a specific tree line or drainage entry. Not fearful, attentive. Like a dog that knows something large is nearby and has decided that large thing does not require alarm. The 3rd time it happened, my father was with me. He watched Hatch do his wide circle, and he watched me watching Hatch, and he said, "Steady," and I was not sure if he was talking to me or to the dog. When we came out of that stretch of country, he said that Hatch was a good dog, and that I should trust what a good dog does when it does not panic. I thought about that for years. In the fall of 1981, my father ran into Earl Perkins on the trail above the cottonwood. Earl was 60 years old then and had been running his own trap lines in that country since before my father was grown. He was a quiet, bony man with a grey beard and a way of stopping mid-sentence to think that made you think he was done talking when he was not. He and my father had an arrangement on some of the lines, and they ran into each other out there several times a year. My father told me later that Earl had said, on that fall meeting, that he had found sign. He used that word, sign. He did not elaborate, and my father did not ask him to elaborate, and that was the nature of the two men. My father came home from that trip and told my mother that there was something in the drainage east of the vanishing point, and that Earl was going to keep his eyes open through the winter. My mother asked him what he meant by something. My father said he did not know exactly. She looked at him for a long time, and then she said, "She's alive, Ray," as simply as she might have said it might rain. Not a question. My father looked at his hands and said, "I think so." I was 15 years old and sitting at the kitchen table eating dinner, and the world reorganized itself around me in the space of about 30 seconds. March of 1982 was cold and clear. The snow had crusted hard enough to walk on without snowshoes in the early morning, which was the best traveling condition you could ask for in that country. Earl had gone back into the upper drainage on the 3rd of the month to pull his last sets before the spring melt made the creek bottoms impassable. He was working north from his base camp, moving through a stretch of old-growth spruce that pushed up against a rock face about 11 miles northeast of where Della had vanished. He found her tracks first, small prints, barefooted, moving along the base of the cliff in the crusted snow. He told my father he stood there and looked at those tracks for a full minute before he followed them. He was a man who did not frighten easily, and he said the tracks did not frighten him. They made him very careful. He went slowly along the base of the cliff, following the tracks toward a deep rock overhang where a natural ledge had created a sheltered space, maybe 15 feet deep and 6 feet high at the opening. He stopped about 30 yards out. What he saw first was not Della. He told my father, and my father told me years later, piecemeal, the way my father told everything, that what he first saw was a shape at the back of the overhang. A large shape, very still, seated with its back against the rock. He could not see it clearly from 30 yards in that light. He said it was darker than the shadow behind it, which does not make much sense when you say it out loud, but he said it that way, and my father accepted it, and I have always accepted it. He said the shape was large enough that he recalibrated his sense of the space he was looking at, the way you do when something you thought was 20 feet away turns out to be 40. It was that kind of scale. It did not move. Earl stood at 30 yards, and it did not move, and he did not move. And the silence in that drainage was the kind of silence you get in heavy timber after a fresh snowfall, complete and close. Then Della walked out of the shadow beside it. She walked to the mouth of the overhang and stood there looking at Earl. He said she looked at him the way a person looks at someone they expected, but were not sure would come. He said she was healthy. He told my father that word specifically. Not alive, which you might expect, but healthy. She had put on weight since she disappeared. She had colour. She was wearing a stitched piece of hide over her original clothes, which were worn but intact, and her feet were wrapped in something Earl could not quite identify from where he stood. She was not shivering. She was not frightened. Earl called her name. She said yes. He asked if she could walk to him. She looked back into the overhang once, and then she walked toward him, and the shape at the back did not move while she walked, and Earl did not look away from Della long enough to get a clearer picture of it. and I have always believed that was deliberate on his part, some instinct that told him that seeing it clearly was not something it was offering him. She walked all the way to him. He put his coat around her. He asked if she was hurt. She said no. He asked if she was hungry, and she said a little. He gave her hardtack from his pack, and she ate it carefully. Not fast, the way someone eats who has not been without food, but has learned not to waste any. He walked her out of that country in 5 hours. He did not look back at the overhang. My father drove out to Earl's place the night Earl called, and I rode along in the truck and waited in the yard while my father went inside and spoke to Earl. I do not know how long I waited. Long enough for the cold to come through my jacket. When my father came out, he told me Earl had found Della alive, and she was at the hospital in Quesnel. He told me Earl had made one condition, and that condition was between my father and Earl, and I was not to ask about it. His voice was flat when he said it, which was how I knew it was serious. I asked anyway. He said, "Earl saw something he is not going to describe to anyone, and we are not going to ask him to, and that is the end of it." We drove to Quesnel. The hospital hallway smelled of floor wax and something medicinal I could not name, and my mother was standing at the end of it, and she was not crying. She had the look of a person who has been right about something for 2.5 years, and does not feel any need to point it out. When she saw me, she put one hand flat on my chest, the way she used to when I was small, and she was checking that I was breathing. And then she stepped back and let me go down the hallway. Della was sitting up in the bed, and she said my name when I came in. I sat down on the floor because my legs stopped working. I told you that already. It is still the truest thing I know about that moment. The official explanation, the one given to the RCMP and to the hospital, and to the social worker who came from Williams Lake to conduct the assessment, was that Della had survived in the bush, that she had found shelter in the rock overhang and had subsisted on small game and stored food. The social worker noted that this was extremely unusual for a 9-year-old child over 33 months, and wrote in her report that she could offer no fully satisfying account of it, but that the child's physical condition was excellent, and her psychological presentation was calm and oriented. The file was updated, and then it was essentially closed. Nobody in that hospital and nobody in that office in Williams Lake had any reason to go looking for a different explanation. The explanation they had was implausible, but the alternative was further outside the frame of anything they had language for. So the file said, "survived in the bush," and that was what it said. And my father, and Earl Perkins and I and my mother carried the other version and did not share it. The spring after Della came home, when the snow was off the lower slopes and the creek was running high, I went back. I told my father I was going to check the far end of his line. He looked at me and I looked at him, and he said, "Take Hatch." I took Hatch. It was a 2-day walk into the upper drainage, country I knew well by then at 16, and I made it to the base of the rock face on the second afternoon with maybe 2 hours of light left. I stood at the edge of the spruce stand and I looked at the overhang. There was no snow left in the shadow of the cliff. There were no tracks. The opening was dark and still, and nothing moved in it. Hatch walked to about 20 feet from the opening and then sat down, not hesitating, not circling. Sat down and looked at the overhang with his tail doing one slow sweep back and forth and his ears forward. I have watched that dog work for years, and I know what alarm looks like in him. This was not alarm. This was the attention of a dog who knows exactly what he is near and has decided it is fine. I went forward another 10 feet, and then I stopped. Something in that overhang shifted. The darkness at the back of it changed the way darkness changes when something in it moves. Not a sound exactly, but a change in the quality of the shadow. Then I saw the eyes. They were high up, which told me the shape behind them was seated and still enormous, reflecting the late afternoon light, the way eyes do when the angle is right, and the light comes from low in the sky. 2 points of amber reflection, still and direct, watching me with an attention that was not hostile and was not curious in the way a wild animal is curious, measuring and tentative. It was more like the attention of something that already knew what I was. I did not move for what felt like a long time. I am not a man who cries easily. I was not crying then, but I was aware of something loosening in my chest that had been locked since the morning of August 14th, 1979. A held thing releasing. Because looking at those eyes, I understood, in the way you understand a thing not through logic but through simple recognition, what had happened to my sister. Why she was healthy. Why she had not been afraid when Earl called her name. Why she had looked back into that overhang before she walked to him. The way a person looks back at someone they are leaving. I understood what my father's food caches had meant, and what Hatch's careful wide circles had meant, and what Earl's deliberate failure to look directly at the shape in the overhang had meant. They had all understood it, each in their own way, before I did. I reached into my pack and I took out the small cloth bag of dried goods I had brought along, pemmican and dried berries, the same kind of thing my father had been packing into those caches for 2.5 years. I set it on the ground at my feet. I took 2 steps back. The eyes watched me do all of that. Then one enormous dark hand came to the edge of the opening and rested on the rock there, fingers down, the way a person rests a hand on a table when they are listening. It was there for a moment, and then it withdrew into the shadow. The eyes held for a moment longer, and then the quality of the darkness changed again, and I understood without any ceremony or sound to mark it, that it was gone. Not out of the overhang necessarily, gone in the way that something very large and very practiced in deep timber can be gone while you are still looking in its direction, which is simply to say it was no longer attending to me. Hatch got up and walked to where I had set the bag and sniffed it once, and then turned and sat beside my left leg and leaned against it. I stood at the edge of that overhang until the light was completely gone. I did not take the bag with me when I left. I went back twice more over the following years, once at 20 and once at 24, always in the spring, always with something packed in, the hand at the edge of the rock, the shift in the shadow, Hatch sitting calm and easy. Each time I went back and each time I left something, and each time I walked out of that drainage with the feeling of a man who has paid a debt he did not incur but was right to honour. After the 3rd visit, I did not go back. I do not know exactly why. Some sense that the terms of the thing had been met, that what had passed between us, if I can call it that, was complete. I kept the trapline country for 29 more years, and I never went back to that overhang, and nothing in the country ever told me I should. What my father told me about it came in pieces. Through the winters I worked alongside him from 16 to his last year on the line, when he was 63 and the cold was hard on his hands, and he could not run the full length of the territory anymore. He had never spoken about the caches in plain terms until then. He told me he had started leaving food in the fall of 1979, 6 weeks after Della vanished, because he had found tracks near the creek flat that were not bear and not moose and not anything he had a name for. And the size of them made him feel, in his words, that the country was watching him back. He said he did not believe at that point that Della was alive. He said he left the food because he thought whatever had made those tracks might know where she was, even if that meant he was leaving food at the edge of a grave. He kept doing it because the caches were taken. Not all of them, and not always the same season he left them. Sometimes they sat through a whole winter and were gone in the spring. Sometimes they were gone within a week. He could never tell what was taking them, no clear prints around the site, no drag marks or scatter. Just the box emptied and left. He had no way to know if what he was leaving was reaching Della or not. He left it anyway. For 3 years he walked that food into the far end of the drainage on the theory that, if there was any chance it was reaching her, the walk was worth it. When Della came home and she was healthy and had been fed through 3 winters of interior BC cold, he understood what the caches had been for. He said one other thing to me about it. Late on the last winter we worked together, sitting in the line cabin with the stove going and the wind working at the corners of the roof. He said he thought whatever was in that country had understood what he was doing with the caches. Not that it had read his mind or felt his grief. He was careful to say he was not claiming that, but that something in the pattern of where he left them, always near the drainage where Della had gone, always the same kind of food over 3 years without stopping, had communicated something. Persistence, maybe. He said he was not sure what word to use. I told him intention. He considered that and nodded once and said yes, intention. That was my father. He would not use a word he had not earned. He died in February of 1998 in the hospital in Prince George, which he hated because it was far from the country he had worked and he wanted to be near the country he had worked. I sat with him for the last 4 days. On the 3rd day, when he could still speak clearly, he told me he wanted me to have the full account of it. He had told me pieces across 15 years, but he had never told me all of it in sequence, because the promise he had made to Earl Perkins was that neither of them would tell the whole account to anyone. Earl had died in 1991, of a heart failure on his own trapline, which was probably how he would have chosen it. My father said, "Earl is gone and your mother knows it, and Della is alive, and I am done carrying this." He paused in the way he paused when he was choosing exactly the right words. He said, "You do not have to tell it, but you should know all of it so you can decide." He told me Earl's account in full that afternoon, including the detail about the hand at the edge of the overhang, which was new to me. Earl had seen it too, 30 yards out, before Della walked to him. He had not described it to my father at the time. He had told him only at the end of his life, the same way my father was telling me. When my father finished, I sat with him quietly for a while. The room had that hospital sound of distant machinery and someone in the hallway pushing a cart. He was looking at the ceiling and I was looking at my hands. After a long time, I said, I went back to the overhang in the spring of 1983. I told him what I had seen. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I know. You left the bag. I checked the site that fall." He had known for 15 years. He looked at me and the corners of his eyes moved in a way that was as close as he came to smiling in that condition, and he said, "Good," and then he went to sleep, and he did not wake up clearly again. I have been trying to decide what to do with that account for 26 years. I kept it because my father asked me to consider keeping it, and because the years went by the way years do. One at a time, adding up before you notice. My mother died in 2004, and she had known the whole truth since 1982, and she went to her grave with it, which I have always thought was a harder thing to carry than the account itself. She had been right from the beginning, right in the way that must have been lonely and exhausting for years, and she never said, "I told you so," to a single person. That was her temperament. Della is alive. She is 63 years old now, and she lives quietly in the interior, not near Quesnel, not near the country where it happened. We speak on the phone. She has never discussed what she remembers from those 3 years, and I have never asked her directly, because it is hers and not mine. What she has said, twice in passing, in the way you mention the weather, is that she was not afraid. I have accepted that as sufficient. I do not expect anyone to believe this account. I've spent 42 years knowing that most people would not and could not, and that knowledge never changed what I saw, and did not change what my father told me, and did not change what Hatch showed me every time he sat calm and easy at the edge of that overhang with his tail going slow. He died at 13 years old, in the fall of 2000, sleeping on the kitchen floor the way old dogs do. And when I carried him out of the house, I stood for a long time in the yard before I could make myself go back inside. He was a good dog. He was steady in country that made other dogs panic. And he never once told me to be afraid of something that was not going to hurt us. And if you work with dogs long enough, you understand that is a very specific kind of intelligence. What I can tell you is what I know from 33 years on the trapline in interior BC. A 9-year-old child vanished in the Cottonwood drainage on August 14, 1979. An RCMP search ran for 17 days and found 2 pieces of evidence and closed without conclusion. For 33 months afterward, her father walked food caches into the far end of that drainage because something had made tracks in the country where she had gone, and the caches were being taken. In March of 1982, a trapper named Earl Perkins found her alive and healthy 11 miles from where she disappeared, in a rock overhang, in the company of something he chose not to describe, and my father chose not to press him on. She was 9 years old when she went in. She survived 3 winters of interior BC cold, and she came out healthy. She came out fed. She came out with her feet wrapped. That is what I know. What I believe is something I would not have said at 40 or 50. But I am 71 years old, and I am running low on reasons to be careful. I believe something in that country looked at a 9-year-old child alone in the drainage and made a decision. I do not know the terms of that decision, and I am not going to pretend I do. I am not going to put a name to what it was or tell you what it understood or what it felt, because that would be a lie dressed up as an explanation, and I have spent my whole life in the bush, and the bush does not explain itself to you. It was large, it was dark-furred, and it had eyes that reflected amber in low light, and a hand that rested on rock, the way a person rests a hand when they are listening. It kept my sister alive for 3 years in country that would kill a grown man who was not careful. It let her walk to Earl Perkins when a man finally came, who was looking for her. And when I came back to that overhang alone the following spring, and stood there at 16 years old with a cloth bag of pemmican and dried berries, and not a single word to say, it watched me set the bag down, and it rested one hand on the edge of the rock, and it withdrew. That is what 42 years of silence has been carrying. My father asked me to consider keeping it. I considered it for 42 years. I have decided the considering is done. If you have spent any time in deep country, the kind of country that is far enough from a road that the road stops feeling real, you may have had the feeling of being watched from the timber in a way that is not threatening and is not animal in the ordinary sense. Not the hair-raising attention of predator country. Something older than that and quieter than that. A sense of being seen and weighed and found. I do not know the word tolerable. Acceptable, like the country looked at you and decided you were not going to do it harm. I have had that feeling many times in 40 years of bushwork, and I have never been able to explain it to anyone's satisfaction, including my own. I know what I think it is. I have a photograph of Della from the summer of 1983, a year after she came home. She is sitting on the back steps of our mother's house in Quesnel, in the sun, with her hair loose and her chin tilted up. She looks like herself. She looks like the girl who came out of that drainage and sat up in a hospital bed and said, "My name." And she looks like someone who came through something and arrived on the other side of it whole. which is not nothing. My mother kept that photograph on the kitchen table for the rest of her life. That is the end of the account. You are the first person outside the family who has heard it in full. I am not asking you to believe it. I am asking you to carry it, the way a good witness carries a thing they cannot prove, carefully and without embellishment, because it belongs to the record of what this country is and what it has been. And that record is longer and stranger and kinder than the official version of it. Hatch is buried at the edge of the yard, near the tree line. I planted a spruce seedling there in the fall after he died. It is taller than I am now. If you have heard something like this, something you have been carrying alone in the dark for longer than you intended, there is another account waiting for you on this screen. You do not have to carry it by yourself.